I am a huge fan of the Silver Falls series. It's the flagship series of Sungrand Studios, a one-man indie developer based in Australia, and over the past couple years, I've become pretty good friends with Jarrell, the man behind the games. I recently reviewed Silver Falls Ghoul Busters for Switch, and I've reviewed Silver Falls Guardians and Metal Exterminators S for Switch, and Silver Falls Survive for Vita, and Silver Falls Episode Prelude for Switch. And while I've reviewed the newest games, I've not done the oldest one yet. So, we're going to look at 2021's original Silver Falls release, 3 Down Stars. Now, about a year or so ago, right before the 3DS eShop shut down, it got a big version 1.69 update, and that fixed a ton of the issues that early reviewers had with the original release. Huge performance boost, it looks significantly better, and it is an overall much smoother, less buggy experience. Some of my feelings on the game are admittedly a bit mixed, but overall, I had a great time with it. The game focuses around 3 playable characters: Holt, a college student returning to his hometown for a fishing trip, Annalise, a young Silver Falls resident taking care of her ailing father, and Moss, the sheriff of the town. Since I've played the other games in the series, I already knew that Moss was going to be my favorite of these 3 going in, and the game didn't change that, but I did really come to love Holt as a character. That's really, in my opinion, the game's biggest strength: the characters and their development over the course of the game. The story is fantastic, and it has kind of a Resident Evil meets Silent Hill meets Twilight Zone vibe, but it's really the characters that drive the game, and a lot of that is with the non-playable characters that you meet along the way, and you slowly get to know as some of these story scenes unfold, and your playable characters interact with the other residents of the town. As for gameplay, Silver Falls 3 Down Stars is kinda your standard third-person horror suspense game, so it plays a lot like Resident Evil 4. You can equip a projectile weapon as your primary weapon, a melee weapon as your sub-weapon, and another melee weapon as your emergency weapon. The difference is that sub-weapons are used at will and as much as you want, whereas your emergency weapons are only used by a button prompt if you're pinned down by an enemy, and they do enormous damage, but they break upon use. You'll want to keep one of each equipped, with your stronger weapon as your sub-weapon. The combat kind of feels reminiscent of Resident Evil 2, except that the new 3DS's C-nub completely undermines it. That nub is utterly useless, and in my opinion is the single worst design choice that Nintendo ever made. That includes the unreliable Joy-Cons in the early days of the Switch, and it includes the migraine-inducing Virtual Boy. It makes gunplay a chore, whereas it should be fun. Fortunately, there are tutorials on melee combat in the Extras menu, and they can teach you some tips to be proficient enough with melee weapons that you really only need guns for the bosses. But still, it's a shame that the 3DS's design ruined a part of an otherwise fantastic game. Now, fortunately, Sungrand is working on a Switch remake of 3 Down Stars, and with a traditional dual-analog Switch Pro controller, that is probably going to instantly become the best game in the series. What most other reviews really hammer this game for is, as I said earlier, largely fixed by now, thanks to various patches. However, I do need to address the complaints, because while most of them have been fixed, some of them aren't totally gone. The visuals were heavily criticized, and while I can't speak for the launch game, since I didn't play 3 Down Stars until the version 1.69 patch had dropped, as it is now, I don't really think that's a particularly valid criticism. We've got to remember that the 3DS is not a particularly powerful system, and its screens have a very low resolution. Taking that into account, I think it looks pretty good. This game was made by one guy, and it is, especially for an indie game, a pretty big 3D world. For what it is, and the hardware it's on, I'm quite happy with the visuals. The characters have a distinct style that is immediately recognizable as Silver Falls, and not everyone may like that style, but the game's visual fidelity is just fine for a 3DS game. The performance, however, does hurt the game. Performance and stability have been dramatically improved with updates, but depending on where you are, the game still runs somewhere between 20 and 30 frames per second, and that's a little lower than we might want. This can be a little jarring, and it was admittedly something that did take me some time to get used to. The game does also crash a lot, but Sungrand built in frequent autosaves to make up for that, and it keeps your most recent manual save and your most recent autosave separately selectable. So if you don't want to go back where the autosave last was, you can go back to your last manual save. All of that means these crashes are definitely an inconvenience, but they're not a game breaker. And that's good because it still crashes somewhat often. It took me around 20 hours to finish the story, and in that 20 hours, I probably had between 10 and 15 crashes. Unfortunately, that's not really something that can be totally fixed. Despite the new 3DS supporting Unity technically, from what I've heard and read, Unity is really unstable on 3DS, and totally inconsistent with whether it builds a stable build of the game or a broken one. And that's especially true for a game as large and complex as 3 Down Stars. Still, even with all of these crashes, I never had my fun broken. The game was good enough that I didn't mind dealing with those performance issues. If you finish the main story, and you want more, there is a Frontier Fighters mode that has a total of 100 different combat missions of varying difficulty. Jarrell put a lot of effort into maximizing the play value that you get in Frontier Fighters, and it offers an enormous amount of options to power up weapons and characters so that you can customize your playstyle pretty much however you like. Be that guns, because for some reason you tolerate the C-nub, or melee, because you're a rational person. I haven't really messed around with this mode a whole lot since the C-nub really ruined the combat for me, even with relying on melee, but there's definitely a lot of content here if you did find yourself enjoying the combat. Silver Falls 3 Down Stars was the first game in the Silver Falls series, and you can definitely tell that playing this and then playing some of the series' newer entries. It's clear that Jarrell has developed a lot as a game maker, and that's a good thing for us. Still, the world and the characters that he creates in 3 Down Stars are fantastic, and I loved every minute of this game, even with the C-nub, even with the crashes. The puzzles that you have to solve to progress feel very reminiscent of old-school PS1 Resident Evil, and the game's overall vibe is very Silent Hill. And the story feels just like an episode of The Twilight Zone. Those are all 3 very good things in my book. If that doesn't convince you to give the game a shot, then I don't know what will. Now, the 3DS eShop has closed by this point, and when it was still open, this was a little bit pricier than most 3DS games at $25, but I found the time that I spent in this, and the enjoyment I got out of it, a fair asking price. Now, with the shop closed, that does limit your options on acquisition here. If you have a custom firmware 3DS, there are game files floating around on the internet that you can download through shady means and install via custom firmware. That's not ideal, but since Nintendo decided to shut down the eShop, that's the option that we're left with. I think, considering that this is a game that really deserves to be played, in my opinion, given the passion Jarrell put in and the enjoyment I got out of it, it's okay to pirate a little bit here. I've bought a lot of games that were made by a hell of a lot more than one person, with massive budgets, and had way less content than this game, and cost me way more. So, I'm pretty content with my purchase here, and since a Switch remaster is in the works, there's something to look forward to there. That's probably at least a year, maybe 2 away, but it will likely look, perform, and especially control much better on Switch. It won't have the 3DS charm, but it will have HD visuals. I strongly recommend you put on your pirate hat, disregard your morals and compliance with copyright law for just a little bit, and find an install of this game. And even if you don't put it on your 3DS, play it on an emulator. Because 3 Down Stars, while not a perfect game, is a good game. My rating for Silver Falls 3 down stars on the 3DS is an A.